all about it. Latest football scores. Morning paper.
Japanese city is bombed. Japan threatened with air attack. Okay, so these are headlines that appeared on the front pages of US newspapers on February 23rd and 24th, 1938. The reports note that it was the first time Japanese territory had been bombarded since Western forces attacked Shimonoseki in 1864. It was also the first aerial attack ever on Japanese soil. So what does this all have to do with Taiwan? Welcome to the second installment of Taiwan in Time on YouTube. Taiwan in Time is a historical feature published every Sunday in the Taipei Times that is now entering its 10th year. I'm the writer Han Zheng, and I'll be covering historical topics that have anniversaries this week or are tied to current events. Headlines in other newspapers were more specific, saying that it was Chinese warplanes who bombed the Japanese colony of Formosa, and the Japanese city in question was Taipei. This article further clarifies. Numerous Japanese citizens were killed and injured today when 8 Chinese planes bombed Taihoku, capital of Formosa, and other nearby cities in the first Chinese air raid anywhere in the Japanese Empire. Taihoku is the Japanese pronunciation of Taipei. The main target was the Matsuyama Airfield, which is today's Songshan Airport, which the Japanese had been using to support their full-scale invasion of China that began on July 7, 1937. People today are becoming increasingly familiar with the later bombings across Taiwan by US forces during World War II, especially the raid on Taipei on May 31, 1945. That was actually the topic of my very first history feature, written in 2015. Back then it was quite an obscure topic that historians were trying to bring more attention to, and I interviewed an old man who had gone through the bombings as a child. So I'll refer to a lot of newspaper reports in this episode because the raid was reported so differently across different outlets in different countries. For example, papers from across the US and China lauded the surprise operation as a smashing success as it destroyed 40 Japanese warplanes and devastated crucial military infrastructure. Our Air Force undertakes long-range overseas mission, fiercely bombs enemy airport in Taipei, this one noted. And this one says, our forces completely destroy enemy Air Force base. On the other hand, the Taiwan Nichi-Nichi Shimpo reported that the attackers completely missed their targets and instead hit residential areas in Taipei and Hsinchu, killing a number of civilians and wounding even more. A few days later, the paper claimed that the pilots were Americans and Soviets operating Chinese planes, and that no Chinese personnel were actually involved in the mission. Soviets? That seemed preposterous to foreigners living in Taiwan at that time, one of them being US diplomat and author George Kerr, who writes that they dismissed the Japanese claim of Russian involvement as a face-saving gesture.
No Japanese officer could admit that a Chinese pilot had penetrated Formosa's defenses without warning.
Kerr writes in the footnotes, however, that it was later proven to be the Russians. But other sources also suggest Soviet involvement, such as this Australian paper, which printed, it was suggested that Russian planes were used, and this New Zealand paper that stated, the Times Shanghai correspondent says that the Chinese air raid on Formosa was carried out by 12 Russian planes. So, who did it? Did the mission actually succeed? Due to the disparity in military might, China knew that it had no chance of defeating Japan without foreign assistance, and it actively sought Western support, but to no avail, especially with tensions rising in Europe. The Soviets, however, were receptive since Japan was a common enemy. The Soviet Union and Japan had competing interests in the Far East, especially after Japan invaded Manchuria in 1932 and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The Soviets established relations with China shortly after, but it wasn't until Japan invaded China in 1937 that the two sides signed the Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact on August 21, 1937. As part of this pact, the Soviets agreed to supply warplanes to the Chinese and also send pilots and technicians to help with the war efforts. For the Soviets, this was a chance for their personnel to gain battle experience, and also they wanted to test the capabilities of the Japanese planes. The mission was top secret since the Soviet Union and Japan were not at war. It's said that the soldiers did not even know where they were going until the last minute, and their families were not informed of their whereabouts. The first batch of 230 so-called volunteers arrived in China by the end of October 1937 and formed the Soviet Volunteer Group. They were sent into battle almost immediately, wearing Chinese uniforms with their planes marked with Republic of China Air Force insignia. So due to Taiwan being much closer to China than mainland Japan, the airfield in Songshan, which was built in 1936, became a major base for the Japanese Air Force. On August 14, 1937, 18 Mitsubishi G-3M bombers settled from Taipei to destroy the Jianqiao Air Base in Hangzhou. They were soundly defeated by the Chinese forces, who designated that day as Air Force Day. In a twist of fate, due to the KMT losing the Chinese Civil War and retreating to Taiwan in 1949, today the victory is only celebrated in Taiwan, which was actually the losing side back then. According to Russian sources, the Chinese found out in February 1938 that the Japanese were assembling a new fleet of warplanes at the Songshan Airfield. They turned to the Soviet volunteers, who chose February 23rd, the 20th anniversary of Red Army Day, to carry out the mission to destroy the airfield. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of information about this mission. One of the main sources is this article by Alexis Lux, which is based on first-hand Russian sources, including an account by the captain of this mission, Fyodor Polinin. The Soviet squadron set out from Hankou, which was more than 1,000 kilometers from Taipei and barely within the range of their speedy Tupolev SB bombers. 28 planes led by Captain Polinin took off at dawn, flying at a dangerously high altitude of around 5,000 meters to save fuel and to avoid detection. The lack of oxygen caused the pilots to suffer from hypoxia, but they reached Taipei several hours later. Taipei was covered by a thick layer of clouds, and as they were pondering what to do, an opening appeared and they broke through. To their surprise, there were no enemy planes, nor did the anti-aircraft artillery go off. From about 3,000 meters, they dropped a total of 280 bombs on the base, destroying 40 planes, countless hangars and fuel tanks before retreating to Fuzhou. The pilots received a hero's welcome in China, and the next day, First Lady Song Meiling hosted a victory banquet for them. While that's the most commonly cited account of events, the actual damage caused by the airstrike remains unclear due to greatly contrasting reports. Some say that they completely blew up the base, while others say that they barely left a dent besides destroying a few private residences and killing about 10 civilians. Also, only Japanese sources mentioned that Hsinchu was struck. Nevertheless, the operation did cause alarm to the Japanese, as it showed that the Chinese had the capability to launch overseas airstrikes. However, the authorities downplayed the attack, and, according to Kerr, it barely caused a stir in Taiwanese society. Alright, so that's all I have for today. What do you think happened? Those with any knowledge of the event, please feel free to chime in the comments. If you want more details on this story, please click on the link to the original article in the description. Alright, see you next time.